The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Along with Jesus, 2 criminals also were led out to be crucified. And they were at the place called the Skull, and he was crucified together with these 2 criminals, one on his right and another on his left. One of the criminals hanging with Jesus insulted him. "So you are the Messiah," he said. "Save yourself and save us as well." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Have you no fear of God at all? You who received the same sentence as he did, but for us it was just. This is payment for what he have done. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly, you will be with me this day in paradise." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So now I'd ask Deirdre Sloan to come and reflect with us on our theme for tonight. I was in prison and you visited me.
So once again, I just begin by thanking Brendan for inviting me here tonight to share some of my experiences of working with men and women in custody in our prisons. As with many of the events that shape our lives and make us who we are, my path into prison work came about unexpectedly. I had started working in the area of family support back in 1993. My job at that time was to deliver parenting programs to mums and dads in the community, in schools and in church groups. The programs were designed to support parents from all walks of life, and being a parent myself, I understood only too well some of the challenges of bringing up children and how important it was to get support for ourselves as parents. It was a few years later that I was approached by a probation officer who asked if I knew of any similar programs designed for parents in prison. This was a group I had never given any thought to. So the short answer was no, I didn't. But I decided to check it out and eventually came to the same conclusion that she had. There was nothing to meet the needs of this particular group of parents. At that stage, I could have just left it there, but her query had triggered an interest in me that I didn't even know I had. And so further conversations took place, and we agreed to try to find a way of working with some of the men and women she was talking about. It was only when she had arranged for me to go to the prison with her and meet some of these people that I began to question what it was I was agreeing to. And at that stage, I have to admit, a lot of fear and anxiety had begun to emerge. I had no personal experience of prisons, and although I was aware of a few people over the years who'd ended up in prison, I wasn't closely connected to any of them, so my knowledge of prison and prisoners was almost non-existent. What I did know or thought I knew was based mainly on what I saw in the newspapers, watched on TV, or heard on the news. Telling family and friends where I might be working didn't offer any reassurances either. Like me, they too had limited knowledge and were worried it may not be a safe place to be, with some even asking me, did prisoners really deserve any help? After all, if they cared about their children and family, they wouldn't have committed their crimes. And what about the victims of crime, many had asked? What help did they get? Aren't they more deserving than the offender? I'm sure many of you will agree that these were all reasonable questions. I didn't have the answers, and though I understood their views, I decided to go ahead anyway with the plan in place and just see where it took me. I am very grateful to the many people over the years who have helped me answer some of those questions and helped me to satisfy myself that working with those in custody and their families is just as important as working with families in any other area of our society. One of the key things I remember being told in the early days that has stayed with me through my years of working in prisons was, people are sent to prison as punishment, not for punishment. Understanding this helped me think a bit more clearly about where I might fit in, what my role might be in a prison setting. Understanding that it's our judiciary system that has responsibility for enforcing the law, who review the offence committed, and who apply relevant sentences, licensing conditions, was very helpful. Accepting this allowed me to focus on the person in front of me, without feeling I was being disloyal to victims of crime, or feeling I had to make any judgment about their offence. 25 years on, and I can still remember that first prison visit. I remember the security processes that I had to go through, the staff in uniform, the alarms that were sounding, the many gates and turnstiles to go through, the wire, the fence, the walls. But the image that has stayed with me most was how grey everything was. It was grey inside and it was grey outside. If I had to pick a colour to depict a prison, it would be the colour grey. As in most new jobs we take up, we arrive with some idea of how things are going to be, what we will find, who we will work with, and some of the issues we may encounter. I was fairly sure that in this line of work, I was going to meet lots of hard men and hard women. I was sure the environment would be hostile and tense, and I was pretty sure it would be challenging work. I hoped it would be safe. My initial expectations were not wrong. During my time there, I have met many hundreds of hard men and hard women. I have also met many hundreds of broken, abused, disillusioned, neglected, and ashamed men and women. These were not two different groups of people. They are the same group of people. Behind every tough man or tough woman is almost always someone who is hurting in some way. This does not excuse the behaviour, but it does help us better understand the circumstances that led to their actions and their choices. Although I was going into this environment with very limited knowledge, I realised that I had actually formed some pretty strong opinions of those in custody without ever having met them. I realised as my work continued that I did have a stereotype in my head of what a prisoner was. And yet, as I met people in prison, this stereotype was being strongly challenged. In my prison work, I have met people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, from all communities, and from all age groups. I have met people who were in prison for the first time in their lives and who will never be back there again. And I have met others who are part of the revolving door, as it is sometimes called, regularly in and out of prison throughout their lives. I have met people with third-level education degrees, and I have met others barely able to read or write. I have met people with no family to turn to for support or direction, and I have met others with loving, caring family all around them. What I learned from this was that any one of us could end up in prison, given the right or wrong set of circumstances. Though it is pretty obvious to me now, I was surprised to realise that each person I met was so much more than just a prisoner. They were sons or daughters, brothers or sisters, mothers or fathers, friends, neighbours, colleagues. As well as having committed a crime, they had many other aspects to their personality and to their lives. And so, from early on, I started to refer to those I worked with as parents, as mum or dad, rather than prisoner. And this had an immediate positive impact, as maybe for the first time for some, they were being seen as more than just an offender. My main focus was to help them understand the impact their poor choices and offending behaviours were having on their family, but especially on their children. No parent wants to hear they are causing pain to those they love. Many coped with this by blocking it out and trying not to think about it too much, or by saying their children were too young to understand, so weren't really affected by their absence from their life, or by the chaos that a life of crime can bring to a family. The work I undertook was to help them face the reality of what they were doing to those they said they loved and who loved them. Despite what anybody says, there is no such thing as a victimless crime. All crime impacts on others, as well as on the person committing the crime. It was definitely difficult and challenging work, but also probably one of the most rewarding aspects of my career, especially when I saw many of the parents we worked with start to understand that their choices and actions were putting stress and strain on their children. And for many, this was a strong motivating factor for making changes to their own lifestyles. As my work progressed, I became aware of a whole other group of people I hadn't previously given much thought to, and that was the family of those in prison. I met with husbands, wives, partners, and parents who were heartbroken by the actions of their loved ones. I listened to family members who were suffering not only from the separation from a loved one, but because they too felt shame and guilt and blame. Even though they hadn't done nothing wrong, they felt guilty by association. I listened to children talking about missing their mum or dad from their lives. If a child suffers the loss of a parent through bereavement, there will usually be support and empathy available to them, and so there should be. Their parent will be spoken about frequently, with warmth and with love. Anniversaries will become occasions to celebrate their lives. Children will be encouraged to feel their feelings and will be comforted in their sadness and in their distress. The child is usually able to come to terms with their loss in a supportive, nurturing environment. If a child loses a parent to prison, there is very little support provided. Most times, it's not even acknowledged that the child has suffered a loss. To society, this may be just another criminal taken off the streets, put behind bars where he or she belongs. But to the child, it is still mummy or daddy, despite what they've done. At the very least, children need to have somewhere they can talk about this loss without feeling judged themselves or feeling bad for still loving their parent and wanting a relationship with them. For some children, they may actually feel relief that mum or dad has been taken to prison, as it may reduce stress or aggression that was part of family life for them. But these too are hard feelings to process for a child without the proper support. Many children will be subjected to bullying from others in school, in their streets, or on social media, and made to feel ashamed, guilty, and embarrassed because of the actions of their parents. Some children will become the bully as a way of protecting themselves. If we look closely, we can often see the beginnings of the hard man or the hard woman emerge at this early stage in life. It is not possible to speak about our prisons without mentioning addiction and mental health. Addiction and poor mental health is rife among the prison population and is quite often a factor in the offences committed. Many of the men and women I worked with have misused prescription drugs, taken illegal substances, abused alcohol, or have gambling addictions. Many others suffer from poor mental health, such as severe depression, anxiety, paranoia, personality disorders, to name but a few, and many, many others have undiagnosed mental health issues. All of the above prevent clear cognitive thinking, and it blurs the lines of right and wrong. Again, this does not excuse the behaviour, but it does perhaps put it in context, because crime rarely happens in a vacuum. Everyone I have ever met has their own story to tell of how they got to this point in their life. During my time in prison, I have learnt a lot from the men and women I have worked with. I have learnt that deep down, few are happy with the path they have chosen in life. I have never spoken with anyone who told me this was their plan, or this is where they hoped they'd end up. I have learnt that none of them want their children to follow in their footsteps, and that they all want a better life for their child, but often don't know how to achieve this. I have learnt that many feel worthless, and many have given up on themselves and on life. Unfortunately, I have also learned that some men and women in prison are not yet ready to give up their offending behaviours and will continue on the path of crime for another while, despite the best efforts of family, friends, or professionals to help them. But perhaps the saddest thing I have learned is that for many people, prison is not the worst place they have been in their lives. Some have been homeless, living on our streets as a result of poverty, addiction, or failed family relationships. Some were abused physically, emotionally, or sexually as children and young people by those they should have been able to trust to take care of them and keep them safe. Some come from the care system and from placements that didn't work out, leading them to further believe that they were unlovable. Some were subjected to domestic abuse in their adult relationships, so the place they should feel safest in becomes a place of fear and terror. There are many other examples of low and lonely places people have found themselves. So, for many people, being in prison has become their safe place. It's somewhere they're cared for and looked after. It has provided structure and routine and opportunity, which many did not have previously in their lives. The fact that someone checks them on a daily basis allows them to feel that they matter at last. As Brenton had said earlier, tonight's theme is, I was in prison and you visited me. A prison visit is usually the highlight of the week for a person in custody. Getting to see a family member or friend is what helps many in prison get through their sentence and maintain some semblance of hope and possibility for the future. Visits provide an opportunity to remind someone they are cared for and that they are missed. If you have ever spent time in hospital, you may be able to understand the importance of these contacts. How many of us have watched the clock eagerly, awaiting the staff nurse to open the door of the ward so our loved ones can come through? Prison visits invoke a similar reaction. Sadly, there are many in our prisons who have no one to visit them. For some, this will be through choice. The guilt and the shame they feel prevents them from looking their loved ones in the eye, and they have decided that their family are better off without them, and they refuse to accept any visits from them. For others, family and friends may be no longer able to continue to offer support as they feel nothing ever changes regardless of what they do. And they decide they have to step back for their own health and well-being, and at times this will be the right choice for that family. Others may be from a different country with no relatives living nearby. Unless you have a loved one in custody, it is unlikely that you will ever need to visit someone in prison. So tonight's theme may seem irrelevant to you. However, we can still show compassion and kindness to those in custody and to their families, even though we may never meet them. Before we buy the newspaper with the sensationalist headline about someone in jail, maybe we could spare a thought for the family of this person, who may be trying desperately to get on with their own life and who will have to begin again to deal with the looks and the comments and the gossip that such stories provoke. Before we judge the neighbour we know who has a son or daughter or husband or wife in jail, we could remind ourselves that this person has committed no crime and we have no right to hold them accountable for the actions of others. If our friends are gossiping about a person's past, maybe we could remind them that everyone deserves the chance to leave their past behind and move on. We can all choose to avoid those social media sites where people appoint themselves judge and jury for another human being. And maybe next time we meet a child whose parent is in prison, we will remember that they are grieving and will be able to show some compassion for their loss. I said earlier this evening that if I had to choose a colour to depict a prison, it would be the colour grey. In a world where we often like to take the moral high ground, where we see things only in terms of good or bad, right or wrong, it is worth reminding ourselves that life is rarely ever black or white, but many shades of grey. We all have the opportunity to make our communities kinder and more compassionate places to live. And in doing so, we can release ourselves from our own internal prison of prejudice and judgment. Thank you for listening.